Right, so today we are attempting something that no one has been brave enough to ever try and do, which is to build an entire gaming computer using nothing but components bought from CeX. So this is everything we need. This is power supply, motherboard, cooling, graphics, RAM, processor, extras, all done using nothing but CeX. And our goal today is sort of to do it around the £50 mark, because if it can be done, this could be really good value. Now, some people are already probably thinking, but budget builds. You can't get a hold of cases, you can't get a hold of cooling, you can't get a hold of power supplies from CeX. True, but you can get a hold of a whole computer containing these things. And this is the £13 CeX custom PC that we bought a little while ago, which is going to serve as the base of this system. Now, there is a full video on this computer, but it has everything we need. It is a case, and it does have the basic components we need that you can't buy separately on their own. So we have a 250 watt FSP group power supply, we have a decent Gigabyte 1155 motherboard, we have some storage. It's a full system that works, and there is a video covering this. It's a bit of a basic machine, but it does work for the money we paid. It is quite a basic PC. I mean, it definitely has its downsides. It is running a GT 430, and according to the marketing, is competing against Intel integrated graphics from 2006. The hard drive works, but takes about 5 to 10 minutes to boot to Windows, and eventually, when it does get to Windows, I'll show you what I mean about performance. As far as a base to work from goes, we do have a Core i3 in here. Ivy Bridge, not too bad, only 2 cores, but hey, it works. We have 6GB of DDR3, which is running about 1600 MHz, with a hard drive that mostly just does this because it's a hard drive trying to deal with the modern day, and we have the GT 430, which is a slightly okay display adapter from about, how many years ago? Like 16 years ago? In terms of gaming out of the box, it can play a few things. Counter-Strike 2 in 480p nearly gets 30 frames per second, provided you're playing online, because it can't handle anything offline with just 2 cores. Yeah, it's not exactly what I would call a gaming beast by any stretch of the imagination. But more than anything, and I think upgrade number 1 is going to have to be something to fix those boot times, because you don't want to be waiting 10 minutes every time your computer turns on, and it's nothing to do with this computer being problematic, it's all down to how modern operating systems deal with a hard drive. So in box number 1, just to round us up to a nice number, we should have an SSD for this system. And this here is our £2, if it is actually what it says it's going to be. It's going to be basic. Our quality of life upgrade Toshiba solid state drive, which we got for just £2. And you can probably tell why. This thing looks very basic. It had one review saying 1 star, it didn't work. And if this is the returned unit they took in, this may not even work. But upgrade number 1, which brings us to a total of £15, is putting an SSD in here. Well, this is a nice and easy one to do. We'll pinch the SATA cable out of our hard drive, we'll pinch the power out of the hard drive. It is recognising the Toshiba, but what we'll do is we'll boot to a Windows installation, quickly install Windows 10 IoT on here, just double check that it is able to actually function. Okay, there is actually partitions left on the SSD. That doesn't really matter too much for us. These lower capacity drives haven't really gone up in price. I still see them at sub £5. Because they just list them up with whatever model name they've got, and a lot of the time they just stick around because I've got a drawer full of SSDs this size, which are great for just being boot devices for older or simpler systems, but a lot of the time I usually go for something higher capacity. But for something like this, £2 to be able to have it boot speedily is pretty good. So we'll let this install, make sure it works, and then that's upgrade number 1 done. So how quick does it actually turn on now? Previously to this, it was around 10 minutes. Now, how quick do we get to Windows from the boot screen? 3, 4 seconds. It is now 4 seconds to boot from the BIOS post screen to Windows. So the system's now usable. But this is the first big upgrade I want to make. That Core i3 seems to be hanging in there okay, and the 6 gigs isn't doing too bad. But this GT 430, well, as you saw, it can handle 480p gaming, and that is about it. I treated us to a new graphics card, and this makes up the bulk of what I've spent. This was £35, and this is meant to be, I don't even know how to pronounce the name of this because I didn't think they were going to ship this. This here is meant to be our Kuro Tushiku graphics card, which was listed for £35 on CeX. Apparently it's a Japanese wholesale brand, but this is meant to be an RX 5500 XT for £35, which is a bargain by itself. It's an XFX. I can see that much already. Right. Yeah, this is the big one. This is what is going to transform this into a gaming PC. So no, it is not in fact the weird Japanese wholesale version I ordered, which is probably a good thing. This is, they've even left the sticker on the back, the 5500 XT 4GB GDDR6, and it even says it down here, so yeah, this is just an XFX card. And I believe with a little bit of tweaking, we can not only fit this in the system, but get power consumption down to a level where it won't trip the power supply. Now, we did modify this GT430 with thermal pads and overclocking, but I don't think it's going to win out against this. I didn't say this would be pretty. Usually these just pop clean out, but look, it's almost like it's got a little blob of weld. I thought it'd be whether or not it could fit in the case, not whether or not the I/O shields were actually welded in. That was ridiculous. I suppose maybe Zoostorm didn't want you doing what we're doing here today. And we will pinch DVD power. Well, let's see, does this actually turn on? It hasn't tripped the power supply, so the first thing we're going to try and do is bring power consumption down, restrict power limits. So let's go ahead, I'm going to download some drivers. This is probably a first for me where I'm more worried about the power supply surviving the install of drivers than the graphics card itself. But anyway, we're just going to go ahead, install absolutely everything with their default express settings. It's only really the boot up process where the graphics card momentarily draws all its power that's been causing us problems so far. But it will probably do a similar thing when it installs the drivers. I've never used a 5500 XT, but it was ridiculously cheap. I mean, this was half what they normally cost, so I thought we might as well try it. Well, it is reporting back, RX 5500 XT, 4 gigs of GDDR6 memory. Right, so weird things are happening with SSD support, likely because we've added a stupidly powerful graphics card to a £12 system. Well, one quick restart later, and apparently we can now run TimeSpy. It's running at about 7 to 8 frames per second, which is actually pretty awful for a 5500 XT. Drop this to 150, drop clocks to 1750, increase power limit to let it maybe boost up where it needs to go to, 36, I mean, that's what I mean, this is power efficient, it's not using much power, but that's with my custom settings. So what if we cancel that and we actually run a full stress test? So, but it's not clocking up, look. The graphics card is staying at its base clock speed. The actual graphics card itself is stuck at 300 megahertz. This is an XFX feature where it goes into a safety mode. Weird. I don't like that. I don't like a graphics card trying to be smarter than me. This is the most ridiculous situation I've ever found myself in regarding power efficiency, because I know better than a graphics card. Frequency maxed out lets it do 400 megahertz. After doing a decent chunk of researching, especially across XFX cards, apparently this could be a genuine fault. So I'm going to try this real quick in an actual computer, see if it actually clocks up to where it should be. Well, would you look at that? It also did the weird turn-off thing. And it turns out, even after we get drivers installed, it is still running at a capped clock speed. My PC has a 1200 watt Corsair power supply with actual dedicated 8 pins. Because even on a proper system like this should just be running fine. I'd left the card running a stress test for a bit, and yeah, even on my actual computer, it's just turning off the entire system. No longer working, which is why someone's traded it in. Because it still runs in limp mode. It's not looking great, is it? I mean, what have I got on hand I can talk about? This R9 is about twice as powerful easily. It's performing so badly, it's bottlenecking a Core i3 from about 2012. There's the average over here, 3,712. We scored 1,377, which is 3 times less than it should be. Well, unfortunately, I've tried near enough everything, and this card is now truly dead. I can't even get a signal out of the card, so it looks like someone managed to sneakily trade in a dying 5500 XT that was stuck in a safe mode and it was a few boots away from just being completely dud. But not all is lost, because I've been back on the CEX website and seemingly like no time has passed at all, we have our second graphics card, this time being a 20 quid R9 380, which you're going to think is a bit of a weird choice, but I'm quite a big fan of the underlying architecture, and I thought for 20 quid, let's find out if it's any good. So here should be our next graphics card. Well, it's actually really good. This is an Asus Strix variant of the R9 380X 4GB, which is more than I bargained for. In fact, this is about as good as Tonga got back in the day. Tonga, really underrated architecture, very power efficient. It's almost like Polaris before Polaris. And hey, 4 gigs of RAM should be enough for upgrade number 1, which we're still trying to do. Let's plug this in, let's see if this one actually works. But the crucial thing is, we know Tonga as an architecture can be very power efficient, so as long as we can get to Windows and start the undervolting process, we should be golden. Right, so the 380X does just work absolutely fine. I've added a little USB stick down here to keep it propped up. But the thing is, we do now need to install drivers. But as cool as it is that CEX have sent us a 380X, the top of the line of Tonga, it is more power consumption than a normal 380 or 285 would be out of the box. It's a cool card, it's a weird card. I've never used one, so I don't know what to expect because this is going to be a first. I didn't want to just be boring. I didn't want to just order a 750 Ti or something and be like, hey look, because it's been done a million times before. Something that resembles gaming performance with a stupidly big graphics card. I didn't think it was actually going to do it. Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, we have done it. We have working drivers on an actual graphics card, and it is now time to find out if this one actually wants to work. Ignore these errors, it's probably because I haven't restarted yet. Okay, maybe we should restart, but at the same time, I'm not fussed. Have I made it unhappy already? Has it died? Okay, I've already locked it up. Right, we'll restart, and then we'll try again. It did it. 745 megahertz. Look at that. Oh, it is destroying the 5500 XT right now, and it's stable. It's happy. Now, see, this is where my stupid reasoning comes into play. Because, as much as we could have taken the easy option, I know full well, from being someone that bought Tonga when it came out, these are very efficient cards. We can. Can we push maybe 900 megahertz? We also can push 900 megahertz. We can't push 900 megahertz, just crash. Right, the idea being we are going to try and make this big old beefy Radeon as power efficient as possible and then see what it does. The moment of truth is now upon us. We have the R9 380X 4GB running downclock to, it's slightly under 970 megahertz I believe, but we are going to try running it through TimeSpy. We now have the headroom to start changing the rest of the system. And it's ridiculous that it's taken me about a week to get to this point, but all we needed to do is survive running TimeSpy. Okay, and even undervolted, 15 to 16 FPS, you know what, I'm going to take that. That's not actually bad performance. I've never actually seen a real 380X actually in action. You know what? For a big old AMD graphics card running undervolted to fit on a 250 watt power supply, I'm going to take that. 2632, clearly we are CPU bound, but the core is happy at 829 megahertz. It doesn't really fluctuate at all, and power consumption should be fine. In fact, because of it, graphics card temperatures are pretty much hovering at 68 degrees maximum, which is perfect. Let's test Counter-Strike 2, because we already have a little bit of a result for that, and we'll see where our new bottleneck actually is. I'm not saying we're in a CPU bottleneck situation, despite the fact that's probably fairly obvious. We've been compiling shaders now for Counter-Strike 2 for so long. We have more boxes, loads of boxes to go into the computer. It's still not done. The match is going to be over before we actually get in-game. Well, it's taken a long time to get here, and we are still dealing with some shader compilation stutter, which does hit these AMD cards quite hard. But we've gone from 480p at anywhere from 15 to 30 FPS to 1080p with competitive settings, now running anywhere from 80 to 120. It's running at 60 FPS. I can't argue with it for the little upgrade we've done so far. If you were being lazy, you could say, yeah, this is a gaming PC. But, yeah, I'm not happy with running a dual core in 2026. We definitely need to get that number of threads up a little bit. Oh, and the 6 gigs of RAM also isn't helping. So it is now kind of a gaming machine. I mean, it's got a big old graphics card in there, now working, and yeah, we've had to return the other one, but hey, nothing wrong with going with an older Radeon. But our next two limitations are the processing power and the RAM. And I've got a couple of nice upgrades, and let's start with the less exciting one, which is the RAM. Now, speed is a limitation, and so is capacity. So what I've done is I've ordered two 4GB sticks for £2 a pop, because it turns out no one wants low capacity DDR3. They've just vacuum sealed them to the bottom, so yep, they've got DDR3 2400MHz, but yep, I'm guessing these are part of an 8GB kit, 2400MHz overclocking memory, but yeah, no one's going after old DDR3 at the moment, so it means you can get these really nice sticks, provided they're lower capacity ones, for next to nothing. So let's plonk these in. It's replacing our boring OEM sticks and makes it look more gamery. Just double check these works. 8 gigs of memory. Let's just double check. Advanced memory settings. Yep, extreme. That all looks good to me. So we still have our slightly lousy Core i3 in here, but everything else checks out, and our memory is running at tighter timings at, admittedly, not its full speed, but hey, it costs nothing more to buy fancy RAM, so that was just a bonus. And we want to get the latest BIOS for the Gigabyte H61M DS2 DVI. We've got our basic little flashing USB stick. The problem with the AMD error that I keep hiding out of the way is it stops you from hitting turn off. So yeah, we'll just use the actual off button. Of course, the most stable way of doing this is using used CeX Parts. Right, so we'll let that boot up, and while that does, we have the final part of this PC build. So inside here is our new processor, and this is the Core i7-3770T, which is the ultra-low power version, which I picked up for just £12. It's dirty. It's also not the processor as well. This is one of the realities of ordering from CeX. Right, we'll ignore the blue screen in the background, because I don't know why it's doing that. But if we ignore that for a couple of seconds, this isn't actually the 3770T, this is the 3770S. They're borderline the exact same chip, but this one uses a little bit more power and also has some higher clock speeds. Still, 12 quid, this should be a big upgrade. We'll just wait for the PC to be able to get back to Windows first before we install it. Right, so what's happened is we've kind of replaced the custom ZooStorm BIOS on here, and it's broken a few things. There we go, there's the error. And it is resolved. There was a hidden option which was enabling IDE boot on the latest BIOS, so great job, Gigabyte! But we can finally now install our new processor. Right, so under this Alaska cooler, we want to be very gentle on the push pins that may or may not be doing too well. The thermal paste is not even too bad on that. That's not actually looking awful. So there's our little Core i3. It's nothing spectacular, but you know what? It's done well. But at no stage is it as good as this new Core i7 that looks to have had a rather hard life. The letters are very faded, so I don't blame them for mislabeling it. So a little bit of thermal paste. And now if all bodes well, we should have our gaming computer. Core i7, Tonga-based R9 380X, 8 gigs of overkill DDR3. It has turned on. It hasn't given us a new CPU warning, but we'll try and do a little bit of tweaking, see if we can gain a bit of extra performance. It hasn't thrown the AMD error yet. No, there it is, it's still back. And I think that thereabout is the complete computer built. We've got the i7-3770S, which is, you know, a power cut down i7-3770. It'll still boost up to about 3.6 gigahertz when needed, but at a much lower bit of power consumption. Not as much as the T variant that I actually ordered, but if we do need to tweak it, we can. We have, of course, 8 gigs of DDR3 running at 1600 megahertz with tight timings. And then, of course, the star of the piece, which is the stupidest bit, is the R9 380X running with a custom undervolt down to around 70 to 90 watts of power usage. And it is, well, actually quite decent with 4 gigs of VRAM, 2048 unified shaders, and we are running the modified drivers. So we can finally run Time Spy and see just how much we've improved the system by changing a few components from this basic CeX machine. And then, of course, we'll try a little bit of gaming, because why not? I kind of want to find the limit of what it's able to do. and it's looking probably around 2 to 3 times as good as that old Core i3 was. For a little Ivy Bridge i7, one that's power limited, it's not really struggling here whatsoever. And performance is now looking much more balanced, with the graphics card being the exact same as it was earlier, but our processor also now being a lot stronger. Getting around the mid-60s, same as the graphics card. The system is actually really cool. Right, let's load up CS2, and then let's actually see some gaming. Let's find our gaming limits of the system. What is this actually capable of? Well, it has loaded us into a game of Italy, which is quite a bit harder to run than Office was, which was our last test. But we are getting anywhere from 70 to 120 FPS. The graphics card is now at 100% utilization, so is no longer our limit. And the processor does actually have a good deal of headroom. But I don't think any of us are really going to be arguing that anywhere from 90 to 120 FPS in one of the more intensive maps of Counter-Strike 2 is a bad result for a system that we have constructed using nothing but cheap components from CeX. So as far as a good place to start with is, this is running really smoothly. I mean, that Core i7 has plenty of headroom and rather decent single core performance still. So you know what, Counter-Strike 2, I'm calling this one a success. So why don't we move to something maybe a little bit more intensive? Right, so I've launched up GTA 5 Enhanced Edition with the very high preset, which may be asking a little bit much for the system, going from a perfect 60 FPS down to 2 frames per second. Try windowed full screen. Yeah, that's fixed it. I don't know what was going on with full screen there. Right, so this is GTA 5 Enhanced Edition running with very high settings, so pretty much ultra, and we're getting in and around 50-ish frames per second. There's some frame drops in places, which I'm sure we can iron out by actually going through the settings properly. When we actually look at it, it's CPU usage that's going through the roof. The graphics card is fine. It's not thermally throttling, it's not getting too hot. We just move it up to high priority. Well, moving up to high priority seems to have fixed our problems. Which is a bit of a... I've not seen that actually fix anything for like years. The 380X isn't even struggling. This is sipping at power so minutely, I can just touch the heat pipes and it's not even hot. The fans aren't even on. So yeah, the graphics card's nothing to worry about. But something weird is going on with the processor. What Task Manager's doing? Oh yeah, look at... What was that with Radeon settings? Well, maybe it isn't the processor, but maybe it is the drivers for the graphics card, because look at all of these Radeon settings source extensions. We're still going. Still going. Still going. Each one of these is using memory. Run DDU, get these drivers off here. We'll reinstall the modded drivers. I've saved the undervolt on the desktop. Clean and restart. We'll reinstall the drivers, hopefully fix that annoying AMD error, because it is this close to getting 60 FPS in GTA 5. This close. I just wanted to see if we'd fix the slight problem with the frame drops. And yeah, for some reason it was the AMD drivers taking up all of our CPU time. And it wasn't actually the drivers themselves. It is something to do with compatibility trying to run the latest version of the Radeon UI. What was Catalyst Control Center? I can't remember what they call it now. The errors that it was constantly generating in the background were just using up around 50% of our processor, meaning the Core i7 pretty much had no leeway at all. Because now we're back in game, it's running between 55 to 60 frames per second at ultra settings, which, you know what, I am really surprised about, given how undervolted this entire thing is. So, yeah, we'll try and do a bit of tweaking around in the BIOS, try and get it a little bit happier, but as it stands at the moment, this is a pretty flawless experience for something that has been so crudely bodged together using nothing but CeX components. Now, right now, I was meant to be pricing up exactly what this computer's cost us, but I saw Cyberpunk sitting there and I couldn't resist myself launching up the game to seeing if it will run. I mean, we are putting it into an intensive scenario straight off the bat, and there's definitely a little bit of hitching and stuttering going on, but nothing we can't fix with settings. In fact, I don't even think this is low settings. It looks like pretty good settings off the bat as well. Yeah, now it's stabilized. It's running anywhere from sort of 35 to 45 frames per second with the default settings out of the box. I mean, we've gone from hardly being able to launch Counter-Strike. I mean, don't get me wrong, when it starts saving data, it's a little bit slow, but of course it's going to be. It's not exactly the most modern system, but now that the frame rate's got to where it wants to be, yeah, it's running at like 40 frames per second. What settings are we even running? A few of the nicer options turned on, and a mixture of low and medium. A lot more on medium than I was expecting. And out of the box with these settings, it just works perfect. There's not even any FSR or anything going on. This is just native resolution. That little
still, 380X is doing a brilliant job because it's still got 10% headroom. I mean, the VRAM on it is filled up to the brim. I mean, it's actually quite a well-balanced system. The processor's got a smidge of headroom, the graphics card's using all its VRAM at around 100% usage, and we still have 512 megabytes of RAM free while it's playing Cyberpunk. Right, let's actually get this priced up. So, it plays everything so far. How much does this actually cost us?
Right, so let's recap some pricing real quick. The base of this system, power supply, case, motherboard, and cooler cost us £13, and that was the base of the system we have here in front of us. From here, we've been able to add a £20 R9 380X, which was ordered as a 380. To be fair, there isn't going to be a great deal of performance difference between the two because we've had to undervolt this to make it work off a 250 watt power supply. So from there, this system then cost us £33. We've added 8GB of rather fancy DDR3, which is not able to run at its rated speed but looks gamery, and that cost us a total of £4. No one wants low capacity DDR3 these days. We have added a 120GB SSD. For the sake of testing today, I am just running a preset up install of Windows 10 IoT on here, but the point still stands, it's just a cheap SSD, so adding those upgrades together brings us to a total of £39. From there, we have also added a £12 Core i7 3770, which was meant to be a 3770T, but it's actually a 3770S, bringing the total cost of this system up to £51. However, I've been a little bit clever here because I've actually sold some of our excess components. The old RAM is gone, the old processor is gone, and the old GT430, including its rather skeptical looking box, is also gone. And for those, I was able to sell them as a bundle on eBay for £15. So, I'm sorry to have bought that for 15 quid, but you know what? Fair play to you, that is a refurbished GT430 and everything else does actually work. So that brings our cost now down to, I don't know how else to show the number, but the total cost is just £36. I did already have the number in my head, I haven't actually done the maths on the calculator. This full CeX gaming PC with a 5-year warranty on all of the components, so you could get at least half a decade out of this, has cost us, well, a lot of tweaking, but in total, simply 36 quid. And it's time to find out what it can actually do, because we've seen it can do Counter-Strike like a breeze. It can do GTA 5 at 60 FPS. It can even handle Cyberpunk. But the question is, how far can we actually push this thing?
Right, so just to quickly recap this situation, we have set out today to build an entire gaming PC using nothing but parts available from CeX. And to do this, because you can't get a hold of basic things like a case, a power supply, a motherboard, we ordered a cheap £13 custom PC, which had the basis of what we needed to work from. But it also had a few limitations, namely it was on an older socket, and it's also using a rather limited power supply, capable of just delivering 250 watts continuous at its peak, which really does limit our choices for graphics cards, and our first graphics card we went with, a Radeon 5500 XT, which was scored for a bargain price, unfortunately was on the verge of death, so we did have to return it. I suppose that is an advantage to CeX, is that we can actually get our money back if something doesn't work. From this, we then replaced our graphics card with an R9 380X, which despite being a bit of a power-hungry card out of the box, you can actually undervolt these down to really efficient levels. And this was a good idea because it actually offered us substantial improvements to the gaming experience. From here though, there was a few other upgrades to make. We went for some speedy DDR3 to round up to a nice 8GB number, because if you're buying lower capacity RAM, it is very cheap. Once you start getting into amounts larger than this, the price does creep up quite dramatically. I did replace our Core i3 that the system came with, which was doing okay, but really we need more cores and more threads for the modern world, and we ended up replacing this with a cheap Core i7 3770S. I did originally order the even lower power 3770T, but the IHS was so scratched up I can't blame them for making this mistake. And all in all, we took this, sold the components we didn't need, and it came to us with a total cost of £36. And so far, it's able to run everything up to Cyberpunk. So for spending just £36 on an entire gaming computer using nothing but parts from CEX, what did we actually manage to achieve? Now, we were slightly lucky in some areas and slightly unlucky in others, but in total we've managed to get this thing running a Core i7-3770S with 4 cores and 8 threads, running at 3.5 GHz. Overall, it's low on power consumption and is ideal for a system like this where we kind of want to save all the power available for our graphics card, which is one of the areas we weren't so lucky with. In the end, we ended up with the rather formidable R9 380X thanks to a mistake on CEX's part when I ordered just a normal 380, but we've got this thing so undervolted, it probably doesn't matter too much that this is the more powerful version, but having 4 gigs of VRAM over 2 is still quite nice. At the end of the day, it's not as powerful as a 5500 XT, but then again, that was unusually cheap for a reason, and, well, it didn't end very well, did it? In terms of RAM, we've got 8GB DDR3. This can technically clock up to 2400 MHz, but given the limitations of the motherboard we're using, it is running at 1600 MHz with very tight timings, which is about all we can do with it. Storage-wise, we've got a 500GB hard drive that came in the system, and I've added a 120GB SSD just to factor that cost in, because really, if you're using a computer in 2026, you do need some form of solid-state storage, just because it's that much speedier. I mean, for testing today, I'm using pre-set up SSDs, but it feels wrong to me to not factor the cost of at least a boot drive into this build if you were trying to replicate something yourself at home. We have a Gigabyte 1155 motherboard that came with the system, we're running Windows 10 IoT, there's some Linux testing coming up later, we are limited by an Akasa cooler, which is what came in the system, but hey, at least it's not the worst cooler in the world, and all of this has been built around the limitation, which was an FSP Group 250 watt power supply. Thankfully, FSP is a brilliant brand where the wattage it says on the power supply is something it can constantly deliver. And in total, we spent £51, but were able to sell a bundle of the Core i3, 6GB of RAM and the old graphics card for £15 on eBay, bringing our total down to £36. I don't want to spend too much time talking about how much we've improved the system, but to go over it really quickly across 3D Mark benchmarks, we went from a total score of 168, very limited by the GT430, and by upgrading to the dying 5500 XT, we did actually see a 13 times increase in our GPU score, bringing our total up to now around 1300. Unfortunately, that 5500 XT was so limited on clock speed that by upgrading to a heavily undervolted R9 380X, we gained yet another 1100 points. At the end of this, we upgraded the processor, we upgraded the RAM, we tuned the system a little bit, and finally the processor became the best part of the system once more, showing that if we really wanted to push this thing further, which originally we were going to with that dying 5500 XT, we probably could, but I'll sell for the R9 380X for now. In terms of progression across 3D Mark benchmarks, we can see great DirectX 10, great DirectX 11, good entry-level DirectX 12, but it still Nomad does indicate it could begin to struggle in the modern day. In terms of how our graphics card's actually performing, and I found this particularly interesting, we've got this R9 380X using between 60 to 90 watts depending on load, often between these figures around 70 watts while gaming, and it's somewhere between an AMD RX 460, well 1000 points above this, and slightly beneath a Radeon 780M, which in certain instances it'll probably beat because we have dedicated GDDR5 on board. Of course, it's not competing with any of the other newer cards, but hey, given the alternative to me buying it and doing it this way was to buy something like a 750 Ti, we have actually got some surprisingly substantial performance out of an undervolted graphics card. It'll come as no surprise at all that the Core i7-3770S is a rather formidable chip still in 2026, coming between a Ryzen 3 1200 overclocked, and to be fair, it's not too much far behind a Zen 2 chip like the Ryzen 3 3100, which lots of people are still using today. So in terms of processor performance, I'm not expecting any problems, but the graphics card, it could begin to give us some problems in the modern day. But it is nearly time. See, I am actually really proud of this little system, the fact we were able to sell extra components and bring the cost down, and you know what? I'm proud of the fact we haven't done this in the most basic way possible of grabbing a cheap Core i5, a bit of extra RAM and a GTX 750 Ti, because you could have found a video of that being done 10 years ago. Instead, we have gone for the most ham-fisted approach of running a pretty high-tier graphics card and bringing that power consumption down through undervolting to ensure that we actually have something that looks a little bit more gamery. I mean, we've got the gamery graphics card, we've got the gamery RAM, that's about the only parts of the system that actually look like it's got any gaming credentials, but I do think we have actually put together a really competent system. So anyway, With all of this built, all of this constructed, just how good is a £36 gaming PC built solely using CeX Parts actually going to perform when we throw it up into the benchmarks? Starting off the benchmarks, we have GTA 5 Enhanced Edition running with the very high settings in 1080p, which return us an average of 54 FPS and 1% lows down to 46 frames per second. Overall, we've already kind of seen this a little bit earlier, but at the same time it's nice to actually put a figure to things now the system is working properly. So it's actually a pretty good showing given this was the game nearly maxed out, running what is an undervolted AMD mid-range card from before Polaris or anything like that even existed. This is what I mean, I was a big fan of Tonga back in the day. I think it's a great architecture, and it looked and ran pretty much fine on the system. The processor wasn't really struggling, and the graphics card was seeing pretty much flawless utilization thanks to decent DirectX 12 support. Moving into the world of GTA Online though, and we did see our average suffer slightly, now down to 49 frames per second, and 1% lows still in and around that low 40 FPS region. At the same time, this was completely playable, and I think our main limitation was actually RAM, because GTA Online Enhanced Edition does get a little bit more RAM intensive than the older Legacy version used to, but still on 8GB it returned a fairly playable experience. Now, a lot of people looking to build PCs in this sort of lower-end territory of the market are looking to play games like Counter-Strike 2, which of course are quite a bit more demanding, especially on these older systems, than CSGO used to be. But still, with competitive settings in 1080p throughout the built-in workshop benchmark, we returned a really admirable 136 frames per second on average, with 1% lows down to 101 frames per second, which is actually not a bad showing. To be fair though, we weren't exactly in the best situation here because lowering the resolution down to 1280 by 960 didn't really bring us too much of an improvement to our 1% lows. I mean, it was still 123 against 101, but our average did shoot up now to 165 frames per second, meaning the game did feel ever so slightly smoother. I hopped online to try and put some more load on the system with a casual match, which was happening on Dust 2, that's the one it loaded me into. I was hoping for something a little bit more intensive, but unfortunately this is just one I kept getting over and over again, so I went with it, and we returned actually a better average of 167 frames per second, and 1% lows that were slightly worse down to 120 FPS, which is honestly quite accurate to the workshop benchmark in this instance. So Counter-Strike 2 was pretty much fine with casual play, and I'd imagine in a competitive setting you'd probably get a few more frames than this. So Counter-Strike 2 actually worked pretty good. Moving to more modern titles like Arc Raiders, which is a very well optimized Unreal Engine 5 title, and we do see that we are able to achieve medium settings in 1080p provided we are using FSR 3 set to the balanced mode. Now, the only thing I would say here is we had to have a 30 frames per second cap in place, because leaving it uncapped you could do, but you get a very wonky experience where it bounced between 30 to 44 frames per second, and it just didn't feel quite right. Capping the game down to 30 FPS and bringing the settings up to medium though, returned us with pretty much a 30 FPS locked experience, with 1% lows down to 27 FPS, which, to be fair, I thought that's, given how little this system has cost us, I will take modern gaming at 30 frames per second, if it's smooth, which in this instance, it definitely was. So Arc Raiders works perfectly fine. The only thing to note is that AMD's GCN doesn't actually benefit from FSR 3 as much as Nvidia's equivalent Maxwell cards would, which is the complete opposite of what you'd expect. So FSR 3 is helping, but it doesn't offer you the boost that you might get if we went for an Nvidia equivalent option, which unfortunately, at the time that I was looking on the market, there wasn't really much we could go with. Now, we already know the system can handle Cyberpunk 2077 when we tested it earlier, but I wanted to see what would happen if we maybe boosted that resolution up a little bit and tried to cap the frame rate to try and get it smooth. Now, earlier we ran the game at about 800p, that's what it was running at in that earlier test in the live segment. However, I wanted to try and boost things up to 1080p to see what we could do. Unfortunately, in a similar vein to Arc Raiders, but this time just worse, we couldn't run FSR. It just made performance all over the place because I don't know what it is with these GCN cards, they just don't seem to benefit from it as much as they probably should do, but at the same time with low and medium settings and a 30 FPS cap, sort of targeting how you'd expect it to run on a console, we returned 30 FPS on average and 1% lows down to 25 frames per second. Heavy action would bring us down to sort of the high 20s, but it was never far away from 30 frames per second. And to be fair, you could always just lower the resolution down to 900p and it would pretty much be locked at 30 frames per second. So you know what, I'm going to take this, Cyberpunk on a 30-something quid computer using just CeX components at 30 FPS and 1080p without using the lowest settings, it looks pretty good and it runs fine to me. Now, I did have to try Oblivion Remastered, and I think all of us would probably guess that this system isn't exactly equipped to deal with, well, probably not the worst of Unreal Engine 5 bloat, but getting near there. And with low settings, even as low as 360p, unfortunately, we just don't have enough VRAM to be able to deal with this game. When you try and run this on any card beneath, sort of say 6GB, things just fall apart, you can't do it. We return an average of 23 FPS and 1% lows down to 11. If you were actually inside caves, houses, anywhere that's a smaller environment, that VRAM usage would plummet, and then you'd be able to run the game at 30 FPS nearing in on 720p, and I did give it a good go, and yeah, I was surprised it actually can handle it in simpler scenarios. But for the vast majority of gameplay, you're looking at a stuttery 20ish FPS, and that's purely because we've only got 8 gigs of actual system RAM and only 4GB of VRAM, so that's nothing really to do with the system. That's just how modern gaming is. When you don't have the VRAM, performance just plummets. Unfortunately, in recent updates to PUBG, DirectX 12 mode no longer really benefits these older AMD cards. That's right, we've finally reached the point where DirectX 12, which was such a boon to these cards, has now been updated to a point where, well, you just lose performance by using it, meaning we're back to the older DirectX 11.1 renderer option. But with low settings and a 50 FPS cap in place, which was necessary to prevent stuttering, we returned an average of 50 frames per second, and 1% lows down to 41 FPS. Overall, given the lack of optimizations PUBG has, especially on these older GCN cards when utilizing DirectX 11, it's not exactly the worst showing in the world, and to be fair, if we weren't running an undervolt, 60 FPS wouldn't be a problem. Then again, it was my choice to try and do something stupid, so here I am paying the price for it. Unfortunately, we are lacking driver-side optimizations, and we are also dealing with an API that isn't exactly one that's going to run very well on these older AMD cards, but still, 50 FPS, it was smooth enough. Another newer title to the testing suite with Paralives, which is actually a title that came out about a month and a half ago now, so how exactly is it going to perform on these lower end budget build systems, especially one that's been put together using some rather sketchy methods? Well, with low and medium settings, which is something we had to do to actually put some real load on the graphics card, in a 1080p resolution we returned 30 FPS on average, and 1% lows down to 19 frames per second. The thing is though, when you are actually playing the game normally and not loading in loads of lots at high speed, you would actually get anywhere between 30 to 60 frames per second, but the problem is the moment you were utilizing speed up, which was really hammering away on those first 2 cores of that Ivy Bridge i7, and was also hammering away on the VRAM usage of that 380X, it was just a recipe for disaster. So Paralives was playable, but you would have to wait a little moment for the hitching and stuttering to slow down to actually be able to control the game. It's still in early access, this could improve, but then again, do they really need to be targeting hardware like this? BeamNG is a great example of how far we've come with this system, given that we weren't even able to run it with, well, 720p and low settings, and we had to drop back to 576p to even get the resemblance of playability. But now, with the upgrades we've made to the system, turning it into a gaming computer, we were using a mixture of medium and high settings during the intensive jungle map, with all of the traffic enabled in a 1080p resolution. And how did it perform? Well, averages of 46 FPS were pretty much absolutely fine, and 1% lows down to 39 FPS went to indicate that the frame rate was actually very smooth. So BeamNG, even in intensive scenarios, wasn't a problem on the system, and this means that any of the simpler maps would give you over 60 frames per second, and if you were playing with lower settings, then a constant 60 FPS even in this current situation would likely be achievable. So for BeamNG, there weren't really any problems. One of the most beautifully optimized titles of recent years with Mount & Blade Bannerlord, which defaulted to high and very high settings in 1080p with a large battle size. The reason for this being the Core i7 didn't really struggle at all with this. It's quite a well multi-threaded title, given that it is a custom game engine, which means that it can utilize all 4 cores and all 8 threads with no problems, and the only real limit was the fact that we had our R9 380X undervolted, which is probably something the game wasn't expecting, because it's probably trying to get as close to 60 FPS with its default settings as possible, but with the undervolt in place it still did achieve 45 frames per second on average, and 1% lows down to 36. Once again, this benchmark is reminiscent of the late game, so lots of the early to mid game probably will net you over 60 FPS with these settings, which look decent, and because of the actual processing power available, means you can have those large battles enabled. Now, of course, we do have to get a Bethesda title in here. Before we upgraded the system, we tested Skyrim, but what if we throw it up into something like Fallout 4 Anniversary? As many of us will know, the Anniversary update has been sort of a mixed bag when it comes to these older systems. But how is it dealing with an old Ivy Bridge i7, 8GB of RAM, and an undervolted R9 380X? Because the 380X, and by extension the 380 and 285, they could run Fallout 4 Anniversary, but I do remember there being some frame pacing problems. Fortunately though, with the Anniversary update, performance was better than ever, with a high preset in 1080p returning us nearly a locked 60 FPS experience, which I really wasn't expecting. I was expecting it to do its standard drop down to the mid-40s in combat, but it just didn't happen here. It worked perfectly. So averages of 60 FPS, 1% lows down to 55, combat would give you a slight hit at times, but not really enough to notice, and when you weren't during intensive situations, well, you were getting locked 60 FPS with 1% lows that were probably going to match it. But finally, can it run Crysis Remastered? Well, this did surprise me because with medium settings in 1080p we returned averages of 55 FPS and 1% lows down to 43 FPS, which is by no means perfect, but I mean, come on, Crysis Remastered is sort of the epitome of old school rendering techniques and how optimized they can actually be in a somewhat recent title, because we're returning near 60 FPS with gorgeous looking visuals, and this is on a very basic and very budget system, utilizing an undervolted graphics card and an old i7 that's also power limited. And to get in and around 60 frames per second even in combat with fast loading, you know what, I think this is a high point for the system, because if you said to me 10 years ago, well, this is what you could build from CeX and these are the visuals it would produce, I'd say, well, that seems pretty decent. And you know what, that's a good takeaway, because I think really, that is pretty decent. So, overall performance of the system, and I'm not going to say by any stretch of the imagination that it's absolutely amazing. I mean, the benchmarks I've selected are ones that I knew would run pretty well on it, because I wanted to say, this is what it can do, and here are its limitations. And I think that's what the benchmark suite has gone on to show. For a lot of the popular titles people are actively playing on Steam, for example, GTA 5, even if you go online with the Enhanced Edition, you're getting in and around 40 to 60 frames per second. No one's really going to scoff at that for a cheap system. Counter-Strike 2, extremely popular, lots of people are playing it with their mates. You are going to be able to have a system that can get you through a good few competitive matches, and sure, it's going to struggle in some of the newer maps, but it's going to get you over 60 frames per second for around 30 quid. Can you really argue? I think the last of the newer titles you can properly enjoy on it is Arc Raiders, because yeah, you're going to be playing at 30 FPS, but it doesn't look too bad, and it is a stable and consistent 30 FPS. At the end of the day, we've only got 4 cores, we've only got 8GB of RAM, and we were able to bring up the settings to at least stabilize the utilization and give us a smooth experience. The thing is though, when you start getting into stuff like Oblivion Remastered and the world of Unreal Engine 5, there isn't tweaking that can be done. There aren't frame rate caps that can save things. I mean, it is a case of, if you haven't got the VRAM, you haven't got the system RAM, you haven't got the cores, it's just not happy. And Oblivion Remastered is testament to that. It wants 6 cores, it wants 16 gigs of RAM, and it wants 6 gigs of VRAM. We don't tick any of those boxes. So that is just the limit, and that is purely due to how some modern games are. But for the rest of things, you can play Cyberpunk. You can play it with quite good settings at a console-like experience, and it's going to look great and run pretty well. You can play titles like PUBG. They aren't going to be a problem. And if it comes to any older titles, well, don't worry, I've done a little bit of extra testing to show you that you can play some of those golden era games with almost flagship levels of performance. Now, in terms of the actual proper benchmark suite, it's done exceptionally well, given how cheap this computer has been to build, especially when you factor in selling some of the components from it we didn't need. It's just great at the actual benchmarks, but I wanted to do a couple of legacy tests just to show you how good this is in older titles, because I've launched up GTA 5 Legacy with just very high and ultra settings, AMD CHS shadows enabled, and it's running pretty much perfectly fine. Now, you've got to remember, GCN does deal with DirectX 12 particularly particularly well, and DirectX 11 is saying it does okay with, but at the same time, here it is, GTA 5 Legacy pretty much completely maxed out, and it's getting anywhere between 40 to 50 frames per second, which is great. I mean, it's very smooth, this is a FreeSync monitor, and this is what I'm talking about. If it can handle the newer benchmark suite with no problems, then when you go back to these older titles, well, you're looking at more or less a flagship PC style level of performance, because a lot of these parts are equivalent to older flagships. I mean, that Core i7 is a Core i7 from the Ivy Bridge generation. It was more or less a power cut down version flagship part. The R9 380X is like a 7970 with extra features, more VRAM, and also has the ability to run FreeSync. It's got better AMD VCE. Altogether, I've been really impressed with this little system, but as you can see here, GTA 5 Legacy, it's running perfectly fine. We've still got a bit of utilization left over on both the processor and the graphics card, but what if we throw it up into something else, another Legacy title, just to go and show what kind of performance it can offer. Now, it's a bit of a rare one that I leap into testing Skyrim of anything, but one of the reasons for this is purely because, well, we did actually run this on the system before we upgraded it. And when we ran it before, it ran okay. I mean, you could get a bit of performance out of it. It was nothing spectacular, but it ran okay. But I've just launched it up here with ultra settings, just to give you an idea of how sort of a DirectX 9 era title, one that's still popular, plays. And I'd imagine it'll get through this without the fans even turning on. In fact, that's something I will say. Because this R9 380 is so undervolted, it very rarely turns on the fans, but yeah, here we are, Skyrim, the original release, running with ultra settings in 1080p, and the system is hardly breaking a sweat. Processor is doing very little beyond cores 1 and 2, the graphics card's hovering between maybe 40 to 80% utilization, and there's the occasional frame drop given how single-threaded Skyrim is in its original form, but generally you're looking at a 60 FPS locked experience with ultra settings, and that is what I'm on about with this computer. Yes, it might struggle in some of the latest Unreal Engine 5 stuff, but you go back to any of the classics. So yeah, if you were looking at something to play Skyrim, yeah, it plays at 60 frames per second. I wonder if we try saying that's a bit more simulation focused though. I think that's a good place to start off with, because we've already established the graphics card will deal with anything of this sort of era. But how is that Ivy Bridge i7 going to cope if we throw it up into something, say, like City Skylines? This is the FPS boost mod that you will need if you are playing City Skylines in 2026, because it fixes the UI bug. Everyone always loves seeing City Skylines as a benchmark, but sometimes it's a bit hard to fit it into the full benchmark suite, so I figured why don't we just see if it works as a good way to end off a bit of legacy testing. Because it's still a very popular title, lots more people playing this one than the second one apparently. We're using a mixture of medium and high settings, which is filled up the VRAM on that 380X. In terms of actual power, it's doing fine. It just really fills up VRAM. In fact, it's actually filled up our system RAM, so it looks like RAM and VRAM is our main limit in City Skylines, but given we've actually got quite a big city going on now, it is dealing with it somewhat okay. I mean, I've got to sort out the traffic to fix the industry going on down here at some point. But other than that, for a lot of these legacy titles that are still very popular and people are playing them, it's going to play it fine. In fact, out of all three that we've just done, City Skylines probably is the most brutal, because I'd say for legacy gaming, anything along those sort of lines, 40 to 60 FPS in GTA 5 maxed out, 60 FPS in games from the Skyrim era completely on ultra settings without the fans even turning on, and then those games that have got slightly quirky optimizations like City Skylines, well, even then, I don't think they're going to really be a problem. In terms of being a legacy powerhouse, I already knew it kind of would be, but it goes to show that it does it quite easily. So yeah, the system performs like an older flagship machine, and that does make sense. I mean, when you go back to the equivalent parts, that R9 380X, even with the undervolt, is in and around a 7970, but with more VRAM and less power consumption, and that Core i7 3770S, sure, it's not the top of the line one, but it's good enough and it's close enough in terms of performance, and you don't have the RAM demands, you don't have the VRAM demands, it's going to do a good job for those golden era games. Now, I will get one of the boring areas out of the way here. Power consumption, we did actually get that decently low. In terms of full out-of-the-wall power, this system is using around 185 watts under a peak burst load during a Firmark and CPU-Z stress test. When you're actually gaming, it could be as low as in around 130 to 150 watts, and I'm already going to tell you now, thermals weren't a problem. The processor hardly gets hot because it uses so little power, and that R9 380X is so undervolted, the first time the fans actually came on was running Furmark, which acts like a power virus on these GCN cards. When you were actually gaming, it was so undervolted and so efficient, it would just run in passive mode, which is why I don't think it was a terrible idea to do this. Anyway, that's the boring bits out of the way. It works great as a system, day-to-day usage is fine, power consumption is fine, and we were able to fit it all within that 250 watt power envelope. The thing is though, people will be kicking me if we didn't at least give this a little go on Linux just to show that it can still work. So as we saw just seen, over in the world of Windows 10 IoT, it does work pretty much fine. It works like a cheap gaming computer should. But I am interested to test Linux, but it does have a couple of caveats. I mean, driver-wise, it shouldn't be a problem. We've got a GCN2 based graphics card. Processor-wise, we've got 4 cores and 8 threads. But power supply-wise, undervolting can sometimes be a little bit iffy over in the world of Linux. In fact, I came across a thread of someone doing what I'm doing here about 10 years ago, and they couldn't get their graphics card stable on Linux because it kept tripping their 200 watt power supply. Hopefully we've come a little bit of a way since then, but it's interesting to know that people have been in a similar boat to this. Still, for the sake of ease, I do have an Elementary OS install set up on this SSD, so we should be able to boot straight to Linux and double check everything does work. And if we quickly run NeoFetch, we can bring up the specifications, make sure everything's checking out. This should actually have installed as the 380X because it is actually a proper 380X. And yeah, everything checks out. Elementary OS, booted up in under 30 seconds. And we've got the R9 380X or the R9 M295X. So if we install LACT, we should just be able to straight up go ahead and set an undervolt on our cards. While we're waiting as well, we'll open Steam, make sure it works. It's gonna be equally as snappy here on Linux as it was over in the world of Windows. So we'll get Steam started, and hopefully this is running with AMD GPU. This isn't trying to force itself to run with anything else. Right, well hopefully this will be done installing soon. I have paused Steam's updates, it's just installing Proton updates. But hopefully when this is done, oh it nearly is, it's about halfway through installing, and then we can actually give this a proper test. So now we've got to update the configuration to enable the overclocking. Right, that is done. So now one restart later, we want to set our power limit down to about 100 watts, which is where the peak usage was over on Windows. So we want to take that 975 volts, apply those across the board. Hardware info, it is using AMD GPU, which is what we wanted to use. Right, let's start off with something nice and simple, a bit of Half-Life 2, see how it gets on. Right, so Half-Life 2's launched. I wasn't expecting it to be a problem. We've got perfect Proton support, and the system is not struggling in any way. We're getting a locked 60 FPS, 1% lows down to about 53, 54, so it's hardly really missing a beat. It pretty much is a locked 60 FPS experience, and the processor is sitting at 40 degrees, running at 1.8 gigahertz while it's running the translation layers. We're using 1.3 gigs of RAM, and the graphics card is anywhere between 20 to 40% utilization. So yeah, for your simpler titles here on Linux, if you're playing your Half-Life 2s, bits and pieces like that, I think we already saw this coming. It's going to deal with it fine. It would over on Windows anyway. Source games, they aren't really going to be a problem. What I will say is nice is just how good these GCN2 cards work out of the box. GCN1 can be a little bit of a problem, but GCN2 fires right up. So nice to see that actually working. Right, so we are now here with BeamNG. I'm just waiting for some traffic to spawn in. Hopefully this doesn't lock up the entire system. Sometimes it's been known to, but judging by the fact things are spawning in the background, it is nice to see, and I think it's going to work fine. Will our frame rate stabilize? Sometimes it takes a minute or so to stabilize, and BeamNG over in the world of Linux usually does want a little bit more VRAM than it does over on Windows. Purely just one of those things. It's definitely workable here. You could probably do a few extra tweaks. I've tried a couple of versions of Proton to see if we can eke out one, stability, but also extra performance. But yeah, I think it's just hammering that single core for loading in the traffic, and it's being a tad brutal on the system with it. At the same time, it's a good proof of concept. BeamNG will actually work here on Linux. You're not exactly going to be getting the same excellent performance that we were getting over in the world of Windows, but out of all the things going on here, saying that our GPU is at 100% utilization. Maybe it is the graphics card struggling more here, but it's running with the exact same clock speeds, maybe slightly more adversely affected by them. There was a singular spot in the wall over there where our frame rate leaked to about 80. But yeah, good proof of concept. I mean, I wasn't exactly expecting miracles here on Linux, but at the same time, yeah, it'll do a little bit of gaming. We'll try something else though, just to make sure that, you know, it is all working. But yeah, BeamNG, probably going to need some lower settings than this if you want to actually play it here, but it works well enough. So I have launched up Halo the MasterChef Collection. For some reason I've got no controls. For some reason with the MasterChef Collection, it's not actually detecting my keyboard. So I'm having a few problems. I'm going to try a different version of Proton real quick, but if it doesn't, we'll just try something else. Not really too much of a challenge, but actually no, my keyboard's not working here either. Some weird things happening with the keyboard, because even in Mount & Blade Warband, seemingly the keyboard has given up working. We'll just wait for the enemy to approach, and you know, we'll call it there. I don't want to spend all afternoon troubleshooting some odd keyboard quirks, because I've had it happen before, I've fixed it before, it's just something that can happen. But this is Mount & Blade Viking Conquest running completely maxed out. 30 to 60 FPS, this is very single-threaded, so it's not exactly the fairest or the nicest benchmark. I'm going to call that a win. I'm going to say Linux performance, it works fine. You might have to do a bit of extra tweaking around because these are older components, but generally it's going to get you by. Doesn't matter what operating system you use, you should get reasonable performance out of both. So there we have it. Can you build an entire gaming computer using nothing but parts from CeX? And yes, you can. Would I recommend doing it on such a tight budget? Probably not, because if you increase it to say £100, £200, maybe we'll do a video on that in the future, you can definitely build a much better system than this. Because one of my main limitations was trying to actually get things to fit within that power envelope. And yeah, sure, I could have put the budget up a little bit more, got a 1050 or a 1050 Ti, but you know what, I was banking on that 5500 XT working. But then again, it goes to show that if something doesn't work, which can happen with CeX, you will go ahead and you will get your money back. You're not exactly missing anything out there. At the same time, it's been stupid, it's been fun, but it has proved a point. Yes, you can build a gaming computer from CeX, yes, you can do it on a tight budget, and yes, it will actually work. Yes, you'll have to do a lot of tweaking, yes, things can go wrong, but you know what? This is one of my favourite systems I've built this year, out of the sheer stupidity of getting it all to work on a 250 watt power supply, at the risk of it blowing itself up. Anyway, I hope you've all enjoyed this video. Would I say to go and do this? No, use CeX for certain parts, and then use eBay, Marketplace, Gumtree, anywhere else for other parts. You don't have to limit yourself like I've limited myself today. But for your processors, for your RAM, for your graphics cards, yeah, give it a go, because you get your warranty, and in this instance, I mean, we actually had good luck buying an old Tonga flagship, and it worked fine. Anyway, I hope you all enjoyed this video. I know I promised this after we bought the computer, and I've been working on this as soon as I got a hold of it. It's just been waiting for parts to arrive, and then having to return bits and order more. It's been a lot of fun, but thank you all very much for watching, and good night.